So the three problems which medievals were dealing with, inherited from the Greeks, were the problem of the universals, the relation between faith and reason, and the relation between will and intellect. Why are they important? Well, let's start with the problem of the universals. Universals, remember, is something we have in common amongst different objects, which helps us to call them whatever they are. So, for example, what is it to be a human? Is there such thing? Yeah, what is it?
So like a person who can think, like there are certain genetic qualifications or specifications too.
Genetic, well, back then they didn't know about genetics, but I guess today you could use genetics. What would it be then? Like you actually, if you want to know somebody's human, you take their DNA and then work on it and make sure it's the correct DNA.
Yeah, maybe.
How often do we do that? Fortunately, almost never, right? Well, I guess if it's like remains of somebody you found in a forest and you want to know, was it a human before or was it an animal? Then you may want to do that. But hopefully for the most part, for practical purposes, we don't do it. Why it may be important though? Right, but for our purposes in terms of ethics, remember, and we're talking today about natural law, the foundation of the natural law, as we will mention also later on, and if you read the chapter, is that humans have universal rights. What would be an example of a universal right or of a human being? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Isn't it what's in the Constitution or founding documents? Well, but to have that, you have to be sure that there is, first of all, some sort of human essence to attach all these rights to, and they really do belong to this human essence. And that is the problem, and that problem goes back to Aristotle and to the medievals. Is there such thing as universals? Relation between faith and reason. Why would that be an interesting question? Why would that be important for us? Anyway, but if you are religious, and if your faith tells you to do something, should you consult your reason or not? That is the question here. Because the demands of faith could lead you one way, and the demands of reason could lead you the other way. It was a lot more relevant back in medieval days, but it is still relevant for at least those of you who are not atheists or agnostics. Because if you have a religion and your religion, typically not by itself, but through people who are considered authority in the religion, like the Pope of Rome, tell you something, do you accept it immediately or do you need to analyze it using your reason? And the will and intellect, we actually talked about it before. We'll have to get to it a little bit later. So anyway, they were, first of all, dealing with universals. They considered it to be a very important problem because their whole controversy arisen about the relationship between universals and reality. What is the connection between universals and reality? Are they real? Are they not real? So there are several possibilities which were discussed back in medieval times. First of all, whether universals exist in reality independently or in understanding alone. Remember that Plato, of course, thought that the universals exist in reality independently. They are outside the cave. They are in some sort of parallel reality, but they are real. They actually are the reality. The real world is not real. It is a shadow on a wall. But the universals are. Now, Aristotle, on the other hand, didn't think that they exist in some parallel reality, but he still thought that they are kind of part of the nature, the world around us. However, some people suggested that maybe they don't exist at all. Maybe it's just something we have an understanding. And the second question is, if they do exist, are they immaterial or material? are they actually just some sort of a part of whatever we're talking about, like dogness in dogs, humanity in humans, or is this some sort of immaterial thing connecting all of them? And finally, whether they separate from sensible objects or not separate from sensible objects. So based on all this, they had three positions which emerged in medieval philosophy: realism, nominalism, and conceptualism. Realism, despite what the name suggests, is actually the position of Plato. It stood for those universals being real things, which of course implies that they are in some sort of parallel reality, and that doesn't sound very much like a realism we mean today, but this is realism in relation to the universals. This is the most extensive version. Universals are separate from particular individuals that manifest in them. So Plato thought that, and also John Scotus Origena. Now, why did it seem reasonable to them? First, the epistemological reason. If we want to learn something about universals, they have to be real. If they are not real, then what are we talking about when we learning, for example, what is an animal? But more importantly, for especially medievals, theological reasons. Universals help to explain two of the important Christian doctrines. One of them is why do we have the original sin? We already mentioned all that when we talked about Augustine. The original sin, right? We are guilty because we are of the same essence as Adam and Eve. So there has to be the common human essence to connect us to Adam and Eve. And then the Holy Trinity. Is this one God or three? Well, again, if you use the concept of universals, you can say this is the same thing and it's just three instances of the same nature. They all have divine nature, but each one of them is a separate particular representation of this divine nature. So that's why it seemed reasonable. However, that also creates a number of problems, and one of the most important ones wasn't even realized at the time. But if you think about it, all individuals participate in humanity, right? If there is such thing as humanity. But then humanity is part of what? Animals, right? We are all animals, aren't we? Now, what are animals part of? Well, you may say the being, and the being itself is part of God. So that kind of leads us then to the conclusion that everything, including human beings, is part of God. And that would be pantheism. That's the idea that everything literally is God. So some of the philosophers at the time decided that this is not a good position to have, and they became known as nominalists. Nomina in Latin means names. So they basically said those are just names we give things. They are not real at all. So this would be a position that universals are not real at all. They are nothing but the names. So we are coming up with the name human, but that doesn't really mean anything by itself. There's no such thing as humanity. It's just that every time we see something which resembles to us what we usually call human, we call it human. Nothing but a name. Roslin was one of those people who actually hold this position. Church had a problem with it. Why do you think the Christian church had a problem with it? So remember the two things, Adam and Eve. Why are we carrying the original sin? Adam and Eve sinned, and we share the universal of humanity with them. And another one, the Holy Trinity. God Father, God Son, and the Holy Spirit. They are sharing the divine essence. So if you say that this is nothing but a names, that undermines both of these doctrines. And of course, the church did not like that. To them, that would be very going against everything. Nominalism, of course, also had problems because, well, specifically, it does undermine all those doctrines. And for our purposes, when we talk about human rights, for example, well, if there's no such thing as human, if that's just a name we attach to certain individuals arbitrarily, then how can we talk about human rights? Who has human rights? Who doesn't? If nothing actually is essential about being human, then human rights is completely empty term. Okay, so then there was kind of in-between version which emerged around this time, conceptualism. It did seek a compromise between those extremes. Peter Abelard, who's a very interesting person too, we don't have time to talk about him, but anyway, he came up with it. He explained the universal as just to word in itself being a sound, but representing an actual concept in our mind. So it is real, but it's in our mind real. There is such thing as a concept in our mind which does have specific significance and meaning, but it's not a part of those objects themselves. It's kind of complicated how he explained it, but it's an attempt to kind of combine the two. It is real, but somewhat real, not in the same sense real as Plato thought. And then there was also moderate realism, and that is actually what Aquinas accepted, and that is based on Aristotle's idea. Became most favored solution. Abelard was groping towards it, didn't quite get there. The position became more clearly articulated with Aquinas. Position claimed that universal ideas are formed by the mind, but are based on the objective features of reality. So even though they are not real in a sense that they are indeed parts of like the animals or humans or whatever it is, but they are based on some real features. Kind of in a compromise too, and that was also necessary because you had to somehow explain what is it about humans in particular, which is the most interesting part for us, which makes us different from everybody else. Why do we have ethical obligations? Why do we have certain rights if there is nothing there which makes us separate from other animals, for example? Should we or should we not have separate rights from a dog? Well, it seems like we should, but why? What is it about us which makes us different? So that moderate realism, they used the Latin terms for this, ante rem, in rem, and post rem. So it is before things ante rem and as patterns in God's mind. So obviously, assuming that there is God, God would have a certain mind, and those would be real patterns in God's mind. This is somewhat of a Platonic idea. But then with Aristotle, they say that they exist in things as properties of those things. So individual humans then would have it also as kind of an internal feature, being human. And finally, they thought that they are after things, or post rem, as concepts. Because if another human observes it, that human has a concept of humanity in his mind, and that is a third way. So like in God, in human, and in mind in relation to these two. Now Thomas Aquinas. So we kind of made a slow progress towards him. Now a few words about who he was. One of the considered very important philosophers, but he was not just a philosopher, he was actually a monk. This is his representation at the time, how he looked like. Kind considered very important for Catholicism. For a long time, he was actually considered an official philosopher of the Catholic Church, up until 19th century. Then they moved away from it somewhat, but his work is still studied. His Saint Thomas Aquinas, which he is a saint. He was pronounced saint by the Church. And he is very important as a philosopher. Many of his concepts, even though they are closely connected to theology, they are philosophical. So what was the deal with him? Born in 1225 or 1224, we're not completely sure, in Italy, he came from a very, very influential family. His parents really wanted him to be a political leader, to become like a duke or something, in charge of a city, municipality. They, at the age of 14, sent him to the University of Naples. And that's, if you remember from last time, around this time when the works of Aristotle became available. And he was one of those young people who read them. They were still not fully allowed. Some universities allowed them more, some of them less. Italy actually at the time was more progressive. Believe it or not, Italian universities were a lot more progressive in many ways than University of Paris or University of Oxford, because they had less connection to theology, so they were allowing a lot of works which closer to medicine and so on. And he became acquainted with Aristotle and fell in love with him. He thought Aristotle was absolutely perfect. At the same time, he thought he is fully compatible with Christian Church, which is why he tried to kind of work the whole doctrine around Aristotle. He did not repeat everything in Aristotle. Obviously, some parts in Aristotle are incompatible. Aristotle never thought that God created the world. That's not something he would ever accept. But nonetheless, Aquinas thought that that can be understood. He lived a little bit too early. He was not familiar with Christ or anything. Christ wasn't born yet. So we can excuse him for not being as clear on these subjects. But if you read him carefully, you'll see that he is fully compatible. And around the same time, he decided to join the Dominican order. Dominican order was very influential. At the time, they had these monastic orders. If you join this order, you basically just renounce your normal life. You become part of the brotherhood. But it had some benefits to it too, especially for more poor people, because the order then would take care of you. However, he wasn't poor. So his family actually had a huge problem with him joining the Dominicans, because they didn't want him to become a monk. They wanted him to become a political leader or something. And there are stories that they even locked him into a castle and said, "We will not let you go until you abandon this stupid idea." And he was locked up in a castle for like a year. And eventually they were like, "Okay, we give up. Looks like we can't change your mind, so do whatever you want." So they let him go, and the Dominican order sent him to the University of Paris on kind of a scholarship, you may say, at the time. So he was studying at the University of Paris, then at Cologne with Albert the Great, who was one of the most important philosophers at the time. And then he was sent back to Paris as a doctor, and he was lecturing there for a number of years. He wrote enormous amount of work. It's just amazing how one person can be so productive. But he also had secretaries. He had like 4 people actually writing for him. He was just dictating it, and they were writing it. So that kind of explains it. Otherwise, I couldn't imagine anybody being that productive. Just Summa Theologica is like huge. There's many volumes to it, and that's just one of his many works. Anyway, at one point, though, in December 1273, he said that he had a mystical experience, which is also kind of interesting. He said he saw something. He did not describe what it was, but it was so important that all the human things now seemed like a straw to him. So he was not writing after that point. And in fact, very soon after that, just a few months later, he was on his way to the one of the church councils, hit his head on a tree, and died. Well, back then, I guess if you hit your head onto something, that good chance you might die, because the only medicine they had is just to let you rest and hope for the best. So he died. He was still fairly young. For a while, there was a bit of a controversy about his legacy, but in 1323, which is about 50 years after his death, the church did finally fully accept him and pronounce him a saint. And like I said, his work was fully recognized. So what exactly was he teaching? We will not go over, obviously, all of it, but just some relevance part for our purposes. Of course, in terms of Aristotle, like I said, he accepted Aristotle. You can see Aristotle all over his work, but nonetheless, he wasn't just repeating Aristotle. He was reworking Aristotle into the Christian theory. So that's important to understand. He is not just some sort of slavish duplication of Aristotle. For Aquinas, unlike for Aristotle, God is the center of everything. There's a Latin term exitus reditus, which describes his philosophy. So basically, God is the beginning of everything, exitus, and also it is the goal of everything, which is where we return to, reditus. So it's like a circle, right? And the God, we start from God and we return to God. And everything basically revolves around God. When we talk about Aristotle theory next week, and I put the reading already, we'll see that he thinks the goal of human life is happiness. Now, Aquinas agrees with that, but he thinks happiness is actually God. That's what happiness is. So the true goal of human life is God. That is what we at least should strive towards, and if we don't, then we are confused, and we are not on the right track. Creatures are related to God, because obviously we are all children of God in some sense, but God himself does not relate to his creatures. God does not change because he created the world and humans. He did not have to create. It was an act of God's will. He decided to create, but he didn't have to. And creation is the process for creatures, not for God. So remember, we live in time. For us, there was a beginning of the world, and we are somewhere along the path. But God already instantaneously, at the beginning, at the end, and at every single moment of this process. So God knows everything ahead of time. Therefore, God is not surprised by any action anybody takes. When we talked about Augustine, remember, he was wondering, or we were rather wondering, whether that makes us still free. Can we be free if God already knows what we're going to do? Well, the explanation now is that God kind of already watched the entire movie, but that doesn't mean that for us there's no free will at the moments when we leave. We have free will. He just knows already what our free will choose. Now, original sin. There is the first big break with Aquinas, with Augustine. Augustine was considered one of the church fathers. And of course, Aquinas didn't specifically say, I'm breaking with Augustine, but nonetheless, if you read his work, there is an important difference. Remember, when we talked about Augustine, we did say that, according to Augustine, original sin made us stupid. It damaged our rational powers. What's the only way out of it? Do you remember? How can we not be stupid, according to Augustine? Do you remember? The grace. Remember, we have to get the grace. The God can give us the grace, and then we will not be stupid. But it's up to God. He may give us the grace, or may not give us the grace. It really is up to him. Now, this is where Aquinas is different. He actually said that this is not the case, that God gave us reason, and we don't need anything. It's just up to us whether we use our reason or not. sin didn't affect our rational capacity, only our moral life. So in that sense, yeah, we inherited from Adam and Eve the sin through our human nature, but that only means that we have tendency to be sinful. It does not mean that we cannot use our reason to judge actions and to find the right way out of it. So that's actually gets us back to the second thing we started with, faith and reason, the relation between faith and reason. This is how Aquinas would look at it. So there are certain things, certain truths, you may say, known by faith alone. Truths known by faith. What would be the examples of Christian doctrines which are known only through faith? Holy Trinity. How do you know that there is a God Father, God Son, and Holy Spirit? Read the Bible. That's the only way. Aquinas didn't think you can reason your way into it. The Incarnation, the original sin, all of these are accessible to us only by faith. If you're Christian, you have to believe it. Now, there are certain things which are only accessible to us through reason. That would be this last part, right? Sensory experience, certain things which science tells us. You don't need to read the Bible to know that the heart serves pumping blood through our body. How do you know this? Anatomy. We cut off human being, figure it out. That's the only way. So that would be this last part. But there is an overlapping part in the middle which are accessible by both, by faith and by reason. What would be an example of that? Well, the existence of God. We're not going to go into the proofs he presented in this class. I usually do it in Philosophy 101. Nonetheless, he came up with a number of proofs of the existence of God based on Aristotle, actually, based on Aristotelian ideas, which, according to Aquinas, we can approach by reason only, by logic, and that will prove to us the existence of God. At the same time, of course, you can approach it by faith. You can just read the Bible, and Bible tells you there is God. Either way, you can reach the same conclusion. The existence of the soul, the immortality of the soul. According to Aquinas, all this stuff you can either reach by faith or reach by reason. And therefore, there's two kinds of theology which can be applied to them. One of them is so-called revealed or supernatural theology. That would be the theology which is based on the Bible only. And the other type is natural theology. Natural theology is not based on the Bible, not based on revelation. It is something which you can use your reason to argue about. Now the relation of will and intellect. I think we also already mentioned it, but this is kind of an important point which created this debate at the time. The question here is whether God's intellect is stronger than his will. God's intellect would be where things like logic and morality is located. So remember we talked about it when we talked about Euthyphro by Plato. The question there is, can God make murder no longer a sin? Is it possible? So there are two different answers depending on whether you think God's intellect or God's will is stronger. The people who thought that God's intellect is stronger than God's will thought that that's impossible because it's part of God's mind, it's part of God's nature. God's nature is such that God is good and he would never accept murder as something which is okay to do. But there were other philosophers at the time who thought that the will of God is stronger than his intellect, so he can change anything he wants, including this. So those who thought the will is more stronger are called voluntarists, and the ones who thought the intellect is stronger are intellectualists. So Aquinas was actually intellectualist. he thought that even God cannot make murder a good thing. God's intellect precedes his will, so God cannot change the rules of logic. He cannot make it so 2 + 2 = 5. And also he cannot make murder, adultery, and other things no longer to be a sin. Why? Because it is part of his own nature, and even God cannot change his own nature. There were, however, voluntarists, Duns Scotus, Ockham, they emerged at that time. They actually disagreed. They thought God can do literally anything God wants. So in that sense, the only way to know what did God want us to do is to observe the reality, the empirical reality. We cannot argue our way to it. So based on his understanding of Aristotle, based on the work of Aristotle, he does pick up on this teleological idea that everything strives towards the end. But of course, for Aquinas, the end is God. So every event occurs because it is directed at some end. Ethics concerns what ends are worthy for humans to pursue. The moral good is not something alien to us, but it is the fulfillment of our natural end. This is where we should be. This is being moral, being ethical, is what God intended us to be, and we can use our intellect and our will to get there. It is possible. Evil is just some kind of delinquency or privation, which prevents us from achieving happiness. If we being evil, then we are being stupid. But we can, of course, use our intellect and will. And he looked at 3 different factors which determine moral goodness. One of them is the object of the action. The other one is the circumstances. And the third one, the end that is sought. So let's look at an example how it can be used. For example, let's say giving money for the poor. Now the object of the action in this case would be giving money, the money itself. Right? From that point of view, it seems like that may be an ethical act. But if you look at the circumstance, let's say you stole this money. Now that already changes the picture, right? The circumstance must also be a good one. And finally, the end that is sought. Why are you doing it? Are you doing it because you want other people to praise you, to give you a, position in the government? Then again, that is soiled. So all these 3 parts really should be present, and all of them should be good parts in order for you to actually achieve this end. Now, natural law, according to Aquinas, is based on reason. We are created by God to live in a certain way, so we should live in that specific way. It is universal, it's God's law, and our reason can get there. It is self-evident to reason. If we actually start thinking about it, we will understand. Whatever is good is accessible through reason. Now, the guidelines for natural law would be, first of all, if you look at everything living, not just even human beings, you will see that everything tries to preserve its life. Don't you think so? Like if you look at animals, are they trying to preserve life? Yeah. And humans, at least for the most part, should do the same thing too. Preservation of life is natural law. It is something you can see in nature and understand that it is part of it. All animals seek to also preserve their species. They have offsprings. So that would be again part of natural law. That is something we should do. It's not only biological and emotional, but it's necessity. Education of the children. Helping your children to achieve their potential. All of this is not even specific again to humans, because even cats and dogs take care of their kittens and puppies, at least for a while, teach them how to groom themselves and so on. So that is something which again is very natural and obvious. And we as humans have something additional. something which they don't have, and this is reason. So we have obligation to pursue truth and to follow all the precepts necessary to live harmoniously in a society, because we can do it, and that is again what God kind of means us to do, and we can figure it out based on what is happening. Because what is happening if we don't? What happens if we do not live harmoniously in society? Is it good? Yeah. Yeah, but is it good for us? No, that's the point. Like, well, we can see by the consequences of that this is not good. So we can figure out it is necessary to do that. And then 4 laws. So there is a close connection between morality and metaphysics, which is why it's kind of inescapable to bring at least some metaphysics into all of this. If we want to talk about ethics and morality, we cannot escape it, whether we believe there is natural law or not. And of course, for Aquinas and for religious people, they believe there is a very close connection. So, since God's nature is not arbitrary, neither is a moral law. There are 4 types of laws. First of all, there is an eternal law, according to Aquinas. Eternal law would include all the laws of nature, including things like gravity, right? The rational order that ruler of the universe established for its creation. All things are subject to eternal law. There's nothing in the universe which can escape that. Then there's natural law. It's a little bit different, because now we're talking about more of a morality. The laws available to reason that govern moral behavior. Gravity obviously is not moral. It's not immoral. But human actions can be moral and can be not. So natural law guides us in a sense. We already talked on the previous slide what we can use to figure it out. Then there's divine law. Divine law is what we find in Revelation, in the Bible. It's somewhat different from just natural law, because it gives us more specific ideas about how to achieve eternal happiness, how to live our life according to, well, in this case, Christian religion. And then there's human law. Human law is whatever government institutes. Interestingly enough, for Aquinas, we only should follow human law if it is in conformity with the other types of law. So if there is a human law which contradicts one of the other ones, then we are not obligated to follow it. The government may want us to follow it, but we don't have to. And the government is obligated to follow this as well. So this was very influential for many centuries. This was rather different the way prior medievals thought about it. All civil law received validity from the principles of the natural law. So when the Constitution says that all, the Declaration of Independence says that we all are endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights, this is what is at the core of it. If the government does something which doesn't confer to these eternal laws and laws of nature, then of course that government itself isn't legitimate, so you can overturn it. The human attempt to illegalize all forms of immoral behavior would be self-defeating, of course, because such a goal is impossible to realize. You cannot pass a law banning people from having extramarital affairs. That's pointless. Nonetheless, the society itself can find that this is reprehensible and punish people by just looking at them in a more different way. And government, like I said, the government, according to this, can only be legitimate if it actually follows all those laws. Although the government as such doesn't need justification, any particular form of government or authority has to be justified, has to have some warrant. It was very novel at the time, because prior to that, most people thought that if we have a government, if we have a king, that's God's will, right? The God decided that this person should be a king. And God decided that you should be a peasant and do whatever the king tells you. But if you actually then believe that what Aquinas is saying is true, then you can also ask your king, is he actually following all those laws? Or if not, then you have right to rebel against him and remove him. Now, so this is probably the most obvious part of the natural law theory. It is, like I said, connected to metaphysics and ontology, to the study of being and study of the reality, very closely, because if you believe there is such thing as natural law, you have to believe in at least some sort of natural order. Now, does it have to be religious? Actually, not necessarily. And as we will see with Hegel, it doesn't have to be necessarily religious. But at the very least, it should have some sort of foundation behind it. So for St. Thomas Aquinas, summum bonum, the happiness, helped explain humans' places in the universe. So this for him is a religious idea. He built it on the foundation of Christianity, and it's very helpful if you believe in God, because in that case you do certainly have something to rely on. But what about the rest of us, the people who do not believe? But you see what's at stake here, because the question is more kind of indeed metaphysical. Is there really such a thing as the fundamental human right? Or is it just that we decided, based on our experience, that it makes sense to treat others nicely?
Try the latter. I lean more towards the latter in what you said.
Yeah, so that in that case, you don't believe in natural law. But you see the problem if it is the latter. The latter then says, okay, I for the most part agree, I guess, that perhaps we should treat each other nicely. But every once in a while, maybe I can make an exception. Maybe sometimes, like this person, he's so obnoxious. I don't want to treat him nicely, right? Or frequently it's related to issues like nationalism. When different countries just have different belief systems, and then who's right in that case? Do you still respect them? Do you still respect, remember the paradox of toleration, do you still respect other people who strongly believe that women should be covering their faces and should not drive cars?
And then that's more of an issue.
Well, they typically, like, I don't know about you, but they would be forcing it on their daughters, on their sisters. They would be forcing it on somebody. If somebody believes that, people typically, if they believe something, they have tendency to act on it. There are very few people who would say, yeah, I believe women should do it, but I don't really care. If you believe really they should do it, then at the very least you should tell them they should do it. And then if they disagree with you, maybe you don't not going to punch them in the face, but you will be mad at them. And you can tell them that you don't like it, which is typically, I guess, how it works, remember, in those type of societies. It's not like they beating their daughter on the head and until she wears the hijab or whatever. No, they tell her a good girl's supposed to wear it, and then she starts wearing it. And if she doesn't, like in Iran right now, right? They have a police going around and forcing women to do it. Because they consider it to be moral obligation of women to wear specific covering of their hair and so on. So that then creates a problem. Obviously, it creates a problem either way, because if you believe in a specific religion and your religion then tells you that women should wear specific wear, then you would also be doing it. But if you believe that everybody, if there's no specific human nature, there's no specific human rights, then it also is kind of difficult to argue with that. That's the way they live. That's the way they want their society to function. Who are we to tell them how to live? Then we are sliding towards moral relativism. Remember moral relativism? The idea with moral relativism is basically, well, if it works for them, fine. There's no one way to do things. Everybody can do them whatever way they find it necessary. But to what degree? Can they literally do whatever they want? Like with this example, when the certain culture was just murdering their elderly because they thought that that was the way to do it. Somebody gets old, strangled by their children. Well, if there's no fundamental underlying reason why you shouldn't do it, then why shouldn't you do it? Natural law theory, in that sense, is, of course, more helpful. But there is some criticism against it, too. One way to criticize it is to look at what exactly is natural. Aquinas seemed to be a little optimistic about that. But if you actually look at the way nature works, whatever is natural, is this always what is moral? What we would say moral? Like even if you look at the animals, animals do protect their offspring and their kind. But do they always respect the life of different species? No. Some of them are predators. They actually very happily kill other species. They may even attack their own species if they are indeed weak and elderly or something. So it's kind of leads you towards this social Darwinism, right? The survival of the fittest. And this is exactly what Nietzsche was saying. Plus there is a criticism of the naturalistic fallacy we mentioned at the beginning. Just because it's natural, does it mean it is what we should do? And then relation between natural rights and human rights. Natural rights for John Locke in particular protect things that are essential for us as persons. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. This is what the Founding Fathers were talking about. But this has this religious connotation to it. For centuries it was not self-evidently true, for example, that women and not white people are entitled to equal rights. In fact, many of the Founding Fathers had slaves. It seems like a huge paradox, but nonetheless they didn't see any problem with the on one hand, proclaiming that everybody should pursue life, liberty, and happiness. On the other hand, some people shouldn't because they are slaves. So some of the philosophers, Jeremy Bentham in particular, criticized the entire idea. Jeremy Bentham basically called the idea of natural rights nonsense upon stilts. The book has kind of a fuller quote about that. So he did not think there is such thing as natural rights. The only rights we can have are what we get by law. Law, political, legal system gives us rights. This is how the rights are defined. There's no natural rights in themselves. Not everyone agrees on what human nature in the first place requires us and what are we entitled to. You can also think about it in terms of positive and negative rights. Negative rights ensure that people will not be interfered with as they pursue happiness. But it doesn't prescribe them specifically what they should do. People still decide themselves what it is they should do. Positive rights, on the other hand, guarantee something to people. To say that people are entitled to sustenance, care, nourishment, that would be an example of the positive right. Now, there is a big difference between different political systems in that sense. Some of them saying that the only rights we should really have are negative rights. We should be allowed to do whatever we want as long as we don't interfere with other people. But on the other hand, others think that positive rights are still necessary And that would be some of the examples, like everyone is entitled to such thing as shelter. We shouldn't have homeless people. Everyone is entitled to medical care. Another problem we can also mention here, it keeps on referring to people as being rational and is this natural part of a human. When you define human, even Aristotle defined human being as a rational being. But can you have a human being who is not rational? Yeah. Some of the most obvious examples, mentally ill people, children. So are they not human beings? Do they have no rights? That already seems wrong in itself to say something like this. And that again, the naturalistic approach, the approach that there's a certain natural way, can lead to very weird conclusions. Aristotle, who we'll talk about next time, his ethical theory, actually thought that slavery was natural. He thought some people by nature are slaves and some people are masters. John Locke wrote, among other things, the fundamental constitution of Carolina, in which he actually mentions that owners have right and authority over slaves. He didn't see any problem with that. And Thomas Jefferson himself owned over 600 slaves. But in the same time, some people did criticize slavery as far back as even 15th century. Francesco Vittoria, who was one of the followers of Aquinas, actually did say that the Native Americans are not natural slaves, so they cannot be enslaved. The big reason why at the time was that they just discovered America, right? Columbus and the other first, what do they call it, pilgrims came here and discovered that there are native people here, and they were indeed wondering, can we enslave them or not? So he suggested that we cannot, because they don't seem to be natural slaves. They seem to be, even though they don't have sophisticated weaponry like the people who came here from Europe, but nonetheless they are freedom-loving people and they deserve to be free. Also maybe mentioned Spooner, who is American abolitionist, who wrote as far back as 1845 that slavery is entirely contrary to natural right. And Mary Wollstonecraft, who actually in 1792 was arguing that women should not be treated the way they are, because the fact that they are weak, quote unquote, doesn't mean that they somehow should be always in a second role. She is considered very important by the feminist movement in particular. She's considered one of the first who has been active in that. So the question is still revolves around whether there is a human nature. What does it mean to be human? Do we have something special about us or not? Or are we just the type of animal who at some point invented language, and because of that has certain advantages over other animals, even though they are not fundamentally different? And based on science, this is what many people think. But that leaves the most important question for all of us, though. How should we live then? If we are just animals, what does that mean?
Construct society.
Well, yeah, one way you may say it's all unnatural, right? What we're doing is very unnatural. We should, well, some of the cynics, remember, were saying just that. We should just leave the way animals live, like right on the street and have public sex and all that other stuff which they were doing. But does it seem right? It seems there is something wrong about that. And we wouldn't want to live like this, and it doesn't seem to be helpful to think about it in this way. But at the same time, you still can't help but wonder, how should we live? Because this is the question at the core of all this. It's not so much a question of how you should treat others, but what is your own goal in life? What do you want yourself to be? And that inevitably leads you to the question of how you should treat others. Because this is the reason why we treat others one way or the other. We have a certain goal in mind, just like Aristotle was saying, and then that determines how we behave in this life.